Nature called and the Druid answered, making its much anticipated return in Diablo 4. My name is Codiak, this is Legacy Gaming, and after 15 hours with the Druid during the game's open beta, I'm here to share my brutally honest impressions of the class. The Druid is one of the true hybrids in Diablo 4. The class has great frontline potential and can tap into a number of different skills that slightly tweak the Druid's kit to make them more focused on tanking or DPS. On the flip side, there's also some decent potential for a purely ranged caster. A number of nature abilities allow the Druid to stay well away from the action, and when you tap into companion skills, you feel more like a Beastmaster than anything else. It's a really neat duality that you don't experience on every class in the game, but let's pump the brakes and walk through this one step at a time so you have a more complete understanding of the class. As many of you know, the Druid is the class I most anticipated playing during the open beta. I'm happy to report that a lot of my suspicions about the class were true. It's a true hybrid, we just mentioned that, and once you unlock enough skill points, you can really lean into one playstyle or another. The Druid was the first class that I played where the level cap really bothered me. Because there is a healthy mix of ranged and melee skills, you need more points to allocate appropriately to really build out a complete Druid. This was so frustrating because I knew with just a few more points I'd be able to really unleash the class's potential, but that's okay, launch is right around the corner. What really struck me, especially during this open beta, was how different the performance of the melee versus ranged playstyles were. I settled into a really comfortable groove with the melee build that I felt worked in almost every single Diablo-esque situation. But when I changed it up and started experimenting with range builds, I was floored at how differently it performed. By comparison, playing the Druid opened my eyes to how off the balance is, at least in the early game, across the different classes. I never once struggled to find synergy and success on my Sorcerer, but when it came to leveling up and completing dungeons on the Druid, the build had to be right or I'd end up dead on the floor. It was a really telling experience about a class that has an interesting kit, but requires a decent amount of knowledge to make work. But that's part of the job here, to help you gain some more valuable insight into the inner workings of the Druid. With that in mind, let's talk about some of the Druid's positive takeaways. I do think the class brings a decent amount to the table, and in a group composition, I think they'll actually be really well received. First and foremost, they have a lot of skills that can expose vulnerabilities on enemies, which gives everyone in the party the opportunity to deal increased damage to them. This is such a huge selling point for the Druid and is woven into the skill tree in a number of different places. Second, the Druid does have a lot of playstyle flexibility. As I mentioned before, if you want to play melee or ranged, there are options for both, and within those options are even more options for how you tackle that specialization. Overall, this adds to the class's accessibility, which I think is a win. I have to say the class is also really fun solo, which I do think is an overall strength for the class. Things like companions add a fun dynamic to combat that make the solo experience enjoyable. It's not quite the same as having an entire undead army, but it strikes a nice balance. I would say the kit is almost designed around solo play, but still has enough versatility overall to make the Druid a solid performer in a group setting as well. As with every class, the Druid isn't perfect, and there are certainly a few things that hold it back, at least early on in the leveling experience. First is the lack of mobility. There are few instances where you can increase movement speed or jump to an enemy, but overall, when you compare the class's mobility to others in the game, it's just atrocious. This means positioning is absolutely essential, especially during boss fights. Second is the Druid's lack of early sustain. Throughout my time leveling, I found myself constantly leaning on health potions to stay in the fight. There are a handful of skills aimed at providing defensive boosts, but very few of them actually allow you to regain health. While this wasn't a huge issue early on, it was definitely noticeable, and because the Druid doesn't have the same sort of damage as, say, the Sorcerer, those shields often don't last long enough to entirely protect your health pool. This is in line with the experience we had when playing the Barbarian, so it might be an issue of balance with the frontline melee classes. Finally is the overall damage output. Like every class, the better the build, and the player, the better the damage. But because of the Druid's hybrid nature, it's easy to build out a kit that's just not that effective. When I found a build that worked, it did solid damage, and I was happy with the performance. But as I experimented with all of the skills and how they work together, it was clear the Druid isn't always pumping out the serious damage. This is something I'm looking forward to exploring more in the future, comparing all of the classes and really seeing who brings the most to the fight in terms of DPS. Sadly, the Diablo 4 team didn't give players access to the Druid's unique class mechanic during the open beta. It's a real shame because while we can see the UI panel, we still don't know anything about how it will impact a Druid's build. What we can see are 4 icons. It appears we'll be able to select a boon from the Stag, Raven, Wolf, or Snake, and within that boon are multiple layers of upgrades. My guess is we'll take spirit offerings, items dropped from enemies, bring them to an NPC somewhere in the world, and spend them like a currency to gain favor. Eventually, you'll unlock all of those buffs within a boon, and you reap those bonuses when you have that boon selected while playing. However, this is all guesswork as the unique class mechanic was simply not accessible during our experience. As I mentioned earlier, I think the Druid really shines when playing solo. From what I can tell, the entire class is designed as a lone wolf. When I found a combination of skills that fit my particular playstyle, I found that nothing could really stand in my way, and while bosses did take a second to kill, it hardly mattered as the rest of the enemies simply melted away. I've mentioned flexibility a few times now, and that's really what I think it comes down to. While some classes, like the Rogue for instance, have a harder time doing solo content when specialized in ranged, the Druid can actually handle it quite well thanks to its diverse moveset. Companion skills distract your enemies, defensive skills allow you to slow or knock back enemies, and your damaging abilities are, for the most part, built as AoE skills which allow you to handle larger groups of enemies. Truth be told, that level 25 cap really hamstrings the Druid, more so than other classes. I never felt like my build was even close to complete. I just didn't have enough points to allocate, and while that's to be expected, it was more noticeable on this class. I'm excited to see what the Druid is capable of solo with a full allotment of skill points. Now, on the flip side, I do believe the Druid fits into group content perfectly. The class's ability to apply vulnerability might not be as flashy as the Rogues or Barbarians, but it's consistent, and that's important when you're moving through wave after wave of enemies. In my gut, I know the Druid isn't ever going to bring the most DPS to a party, but what it brings in utility will matter. I'm pretty confident about that. With other players in the mix, I also think it opens up the class for even more build diversity, especially if you're interested in leaning into a ranged build. While there are plenty of opportunities to do that solo, you always have to think about sustain, and in a group setting, you can get away with more damage-oriented spells, relying on your teammates to distract and even tank some enemies you'd otherwise have to yourself. Ultimately, I think the class is great in both scenarios, but only time and skill points will tell just how right or wrong I am. The Druid brings a lot of interesting abilities to the table, and I want to point out just a few of my favorites. Keep in mind these don't necessarily work together, but are just a few skills I experimented with and enjoyed using. Pulverize seemed to be everyone's favorite during the open beta. When cast, the Druid transforms into a werebear and slams the ground, dealing massive AoE damage. This was easily one of the most effective early game damage dealers in the Druid's kit. In conjunction with that ability is Trample, which is effectively a werebear charge. The Druid becomes unstoppable, dashes forward, and knocks back and deals damage to any enemies hit. If Trample knocks an enemy into any sort of terrain, they take additional damage and are also stunned for a few seconds. Long story short, the Druid doesn't have a lot of mobility, so having something on your bars like Trample actually feels incredible. The skill is both an engage and disengage if needed, deals damage, and allows you to control enemy position, the trifecta. Now, one of my favorite non-werebear skills is Hurricane. This allows you to conjure a storm around the Druid, dealing damage to any enemies caught in the AoE. With some enhancements, you can use Hurricane to slow and even cause vulnerable on enemies. While not an outright overpowered skill, Hurricane does fit a variety of Druid builds, which makes it a stellar pick. A fun companion ability is Vine Creeper. Passively, every 7 seconds, it'll emerge and deal ticking poison damage to an enemy in the area. When activated, the Vine Creepers immobilize all enemies in an area, as well as deal poison damage to all those enemies caught in the AoE. I can see companion builds really popping off once the game launches, especially when you can tap into the full power of the skill tree. Finally, let's talk about one of the Druid's ultimate abilities, Petrify. It's on a relatively long cooldown of 1 minute, but its active effect is incredible. When used, it stuns all enemies in a large area for 3 seconds. Those enemies then take 25% increased critical strike damage from the Druid. If you use Petrify on a boss, they take 50% increased critical strike damage, and the duration of the effect is extended to 6 seconds. If you build your entire kit around crit damage, there's a good chance Petrify could be the linchpin that ties a complete Druid build together. The effect is potent, and with the added benefit of increased crit damage on bosses, I have a feeling this skill will be a staple in a lot of endgame Druid builds. I think we can keep this next section pretty short. Hopefully I've made it clear, the Druid has a lot of interesting build potential, but there is a catch. Abilities do not always synergize, and that disconnect could be frustrating for some people. Because the class is truly offering a hybrid playstyle, there are fewer skills that overlap, and that means if you don't understand how skills work together, it's very possible you have a build that simply won't work. Sure, all of the animations will go off, but you'll end up hitting like a wet noodle. There's also a healthy amount of passive skills in the tree that can transform your build. I honestly didn't count, but it's definitely more than some of the other classes, and those passives add an entire layer to the Druid's gameplay. Because of the way the skill trees are designed, we gravitate towards those big, shiny skills, but it's those small, subtle passive bonuses that can really transform your build potential. Give me all of the skill points, because once we have the ability to really flesh out a Druid build, I think the class is going to be unstoppable. Hopefully now you have a better understanding of our experience with the Druid in Diablo 4. I told you once, I'll tell you again. I was so excited to play this class. All of the nostalgia came flooding back from my Diablo 2 days, but it's clear this Druid, like all the classes in Diablo 4, have taken a step in a different direction. Now, whether that's good or bad is still up for interpretation, but when it comes to this version of the Druid, if you're wondering if it's fun to play, the answer is yes. Friends, we hope you're enjoying our Diablo 4 coverage. While content was limited during the open beta, we look forward to checking out and creating even more videos when the game goes live on June 6. As always, if Diablo is on your radar and you want more content like this, including deeper guides and eventually some fun builds, hit that like button and consider subscribing. We also plan on opening up a Diablo 4 clan once the game goes live on June 6, so if that's something you're interested in, consider joining the Legacy Gaming community on Discord. Our open beta clan filled up within 1 day, so keep an eye on chat and be sure to stay tuned for more information come launch. My name is Codiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching and play on.